Good afternoon and good evening to everyone joining our webinar today. We are very excited to welcome you all to the webinar, Governance of Risk, Barriers and Enablers to Resilience in the Philippines, jointly organized by the International Finance Corporation and the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. I am Angelo Tan, IFC's Green and Resilient Buildings Country Lead for the Philippines and the Pacific Islands. IFC, a member of the World Bank Group, is the largest global development finance institution focused on the private sector in developing countries. IFC's work supports the World Bank Group's twin goals of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity. IFC's Climate Business Department achieves scale and mobilization, promotes sustainable innovation, and sets standards to channel capital into more climate-smart investments. And our partner for this event, the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, or GSD, is a world-leading center of knowledge and source of innovation in the fields of urbanism, landscape, and sustainability planning. At IFC, we have developed Building Resilience Index, a web-based hazard mapping and resilience assessment framework for buildings, and initiated its implementation from the Philippines, a hotspot for natural hazards. Recently, we collaborated with experts from the GSD to explore how Building Resilience Index can be leveraged to promote resilience in the larger urban context. Today, we would like to introduce Building Resilience Index to you, share the findings of Harvard GSD's analysis, and hear from our stakeholders about ways that we can scale up our impact. If you have questions for any of our speakers throughout the webinar, please write them in the Q&A section, which we'll address toward the end of the event. Before we start, we'd also like to acknowledge our donors. Development of Building Resilience Index will not be possible without generous contributions from the Government of Australia, the Government of the Netherlands, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the World Bank. First, I'd like to invite Zeep Nguyen Van Hoot, Senior Manager, Climate Innovation and Business Development at IFC's Climate Business Department for opening remarks. Zeep?
Thank you, Angelo, and thank you everyone for joining us today in whatever time zone you're in. And first, I'd like to start out by expressing our sympathy and thoughts to everyone suffering from the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. And as you all know, the recovery efforts are still going on. And I encourage all of you to donate to the World Bank Group effort collecting for the victims. And these events, as this week's earthquake and the floods in Pakistan and so many other events, as you know, that have been happening in the last few years and just much more frequently, are reminding us that decarbonization and enhancing resilience of buildings and cities is a priority for the world and indeed for the World Bank Group. As IFC, we're an integral part of delivering on this goal. And for over a decade, we've been addressing decarbonization in the building sector globally via our EDGE Green Buildings program. Our experience with EDGE demonstrates that creating an enabling environment is a core success factor to mainstreaming green buildings and resilience for this sector. To achieve this, we've been working on addressing policy bottlenecks and establishing public center incentives, enhancing technical capacity limitations within the job market, enabling access to finance through investments into financial institutions, promoting direct investments to demonstrative building projects, and last but not least, developing tools that are linked to voluntary disclosure systems. We're now replicating this experience with the Building Resilience Program and the Apex Green Cities program to address climate action in the building sector and in cities. Over a year ago, we started our work on building a resilience index in the Philippines. We hope with our program that we're able to promote the adoption of global best practices in a country which is very exposed to climate-related and geoseismic hazards, and to identify financial products and incentives for the building sector. As we envision expanding our Building Resilience Index program globally, we're continuously looking for improvements, and we look forward to your feedback and ongoing collaboration. And through our partnership with the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, across all our efforts, we have been partnering with others to gain new perspectives for increasing our impact. We've developed a BRI together with a distinguished global experts at GSD to shed light on different approaches that can help us scale up our activities in the Philippines and globally to enhance urban resilience. I'd like to thank Angelo, Omid, and the team at IFC, and also GSD's research team led by Professor Diane Davis and Begonia Piero for their contributions to our work. And special thanks to our panelists today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Omid.
Thank you very much, Diep. The first part of the program will discuss IFC's approach to mainstreaming resilient buildings. Amit Saberi, Technical Lead for EDGE and Global Lead for Building Resilience Index, will guide us through this innovation. The floor is yours, Amit.
Thank you so much, Diep and Angelo. Thank you everyone for joining this event. And as Diep said, we are thankful to our panelists and Harvard GST's team as well that joined this event. We have been working with them over a year now, and we are pleased to be able to present the results. But before I do a quick presentation for you so that you can get the context of the program that we are developing on the Building Resilience Index, I wanted to start with a confession, right? And my confession here is that we all know we are all working towards answering one simple question. And the simple question that in principle is simple, but in action is very difficult, is that what can we do to reduce loss from our natural disasters, in our cities and buildings? And do we have the answer to that question? No, not yet. We are getting the best minds together to put together what we feel would be an answer, but I don't think we would ever get perfect. So that's my confession to start, that we are nowhere near perfect to come up with a solution. Why we are here with everyone? Because we are extending our hands to everyone to help us and see this program as a place to bring the ideas together so that we can together try to solve this question. Timeline: this is not going to be solved within a year, within 2 years, within 3 years. This is a long marathon that we all need to run. So, but the point here is that we have to start from somewhere, and this starting point has been very important for us to be able to move towards that goal together. Saying that, maybe I'll quickly start presenting my slides. I know we are running a bit behind. I'll be trying to be brief on my slides so that we can leave more space for panelists and Harvard University. So who we are, for the colleagues or friends here that they are not aware of the role of IFC, we are part of the World Bank Group, and our mission is to provide solutions for private sector development. Obviously, we work with our sister organizations like IBRD, MIGA, and others to support governments as well. But IFC's role is to provide solutions for private sector development. And our view is that when private sector is strong, then the country can grow faster than having a strong government. How are we looking at resilience within the World Bank Group? So World Bank Group includes IFC. In June 2016, World Bank started a climate change action plan that was between 2016 and 2020 and had a specific focus on adaptation and resilience. That led in January 2019 to an action plan on climate change, adaptation and resilience, which included a phrase to develop rating system to incentivize investments in adaptation and resilience. and improve tracking. And under that program, then in 2021, building resilience rating systems started to be developed, and that includes all sectors, including cities, agriculture, transport, and building resilience index is looking at only building sector, so how we are going to improve construction and building safety. And under that program, then we have specific targets to meet in terms of our climate screening within our investments, as well as having specific targets for our climate finance. Within this program of resilience index, we are trying to work with financial institutions around the world, with the banks, to improve financing for resilience. We are going to do more investments in construction sector, and our view is how are we going to improve resilience of the assets we are going to invest in, and working with governments, as Diep said, to improve the incentives as well as codes and policies to support resilience buildings. And finally, developing a resilience application so that it can kind of bind these pieces together and be a standard for resilience. Diep mentioned that we have done work on EDGE. EDGE is now been a green building certification system that's being used in more than 83 countries, and we certified more than 51 million square meters of projects. The idea is we expand that experience to resilience. However, resilience is a very different story to green buildings, and that's why these two programs will be running together to address mitigation and adaptation separately, but working together. What is important, again, this might be a bit basic for the colleagues that they are quite advanced in adaptation and resilience, but for myself, when I started looking at this area, it was quite important to understand it. When we talk about hazards, hazards are location-specific conditions. For example, a location can have flood or earthquake or high wind conditions, and that's what Building Resilience Index is going to report, and is already reporting it for specific countries. Exposure means if there is a building on that location, that building would be exposed to that hazard. But then vulnerability is important because you don't really know how that building is going to behave against that hazard. And that's where Building Resilience Index is doing an assessment of the asset to understand the vulnerability of the asset. And superimposing vulnerability and hazard, then we would understand what would be the impact and risk to that asset. And that's what we are trying to do here. We are not trying to do recovery or after event conditions. All we are doing is bringing transparency to how to design and construct buildings, as well as how to retrofit buildings to improve those assets. Building Resilience Index will be covering all range of assets, different building types, and we would be happy to discuss with you if you have any projects or any plans to work on a specific projects to be able to test and pilot the Building Resilience Index on those assets. What Building Resilience Index is doing, as I mentioned, it looks at identifying the hazards, and the hazards are specific to the location, and understanding the vulnerability of assets. And then putting these two together, there would be a disclosure mechanism to be able to disclose at what rating the asset is. And this will bring transparency to the market from the insurance point of view, from financing point of view, so that we can continue to improve our assets. This will benefit a range of players, from construction developers all the way to the owners and renters, banks, insurance companies, and governments. As I said, this is not going to happen overnight. It will take time, but it's a way for us to continue improving our conditions to improve the safety of our assets. What we have done in Philippines, we have worked with amazing developers and partners in Philippines to test Building Resilience Index. We have piloted in more than 2 million square meters of space in the Philippines, and we will continue to do this work in Philippines. We are also working in Dominican Republic and looking at other countries like Vietnam to expand the scope of Building Resilience Index. We also work with the students with a competition to get more ideas from students and market how a resilience house, for example, can be designed and built. I'm gonna end here with thanks to everyone joining us, as well as thanks to our donors and partners. Back to you, Angelo.
Thank you, Ahmed. Now we'll hear from the Harvard University Graduate School of Design about their findings and recommendations to enhance the impact of Building Resilience Index. I'd like to welcome the Charles Dyer Norton Professor of Regional Planning and Urbanism, Diane Davis, and Doctor of Design candidate, Begonia Pero.
Thank you, Angelo. And Begonia, yes, I just want to tell everybody, we're going to do a kind of a tag team presentation. I'll start with giving you a little background about what we've accomplished with this research study that we've conducted for the last year at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Let me just say that that next slide, Begonia, that we were thrilled when Ahmed and Naz reached out to us, because for those of you who don't know, the Graduate School of Design is not only a school of architecture with a center on green buildings and cities, but it's a school that has both a landscape architecture program and an urban planning and design program. And one of our conclusions, I'm not going to give it all away right now, but we think that picking up the mandate of strengthening assets, actually starting with the building, which is what the Building Resilience Index does, is absolutely central for thinking about minimizing loss, financial, human loss, down the road in the face of disaster. But also it is just the first step, that in some ways buildings are embedded in larger cities, in neighborhoods, and in programmatic contexts. And one of the things we were trying to do is take seriously the importance of starting at the building scale, but questioning whether there are ways to move beyond that. Next slide, Begonia. So I don't need to tell everybody who's on this webinar about the importance of thinking about strengthening resilience in the context of ever increasing disasters. And again, I also give a shout out to the kind of terrible humanitarian conditions that we're facing when we look at the earthquake. But there are many hurricanes, typhoons, things that the island of the Philippines and the kind of entire archipelago are facing that parallel other very precarious nations, cities and nations around the world. So what we wanted to do by thinking about the building, but putting it in a slightly larger, putting it in its urban context, is come up with some suggestions, recommendations for the BRI program to think about how do we strengthen the kind of impacts of investments in the building on a larger scale, on the people that not only live in those buildings, but on the neighborhoods where those buildings are embedded. So in our research, we will come to in a second our conclusions. We made some substantial recommendations about maybe adding some new aspects or new elements, new metrics that can be discussed in the IFC that should go into the Building Resilience Index itself, because it is an index of how to kind of maximize impact or maximize or shall we say minimize loss by kind of laying out incentives at the beginning for builders to kind of follow when they make decisions about their construction efforts. So there are substantial recommendations, but we also wanted to lay some recommendations out about the implementation process. In other words, procedural. How would one move from getting some good ideas, which we think are good ideas, about strengthening the Building Resilience Index? How could that be accommodated in the context of a place like the Philippines, but also in conversation between stakeholders in the Philippines and the IFC? And we conducted, next slide, Begonia, we conducted documentary research and did a deep dive into disaster risk in the Philippines. Again, everybody on this call probably knows about the kind of political ecology of the Philippines, why it's so vulnerable. So I'm not going to belabor this with this slide. Next slide, Begonia. We know it's a high risk place, which is why it's a pilot place for conducting this research and asking these questions. But we also want to underscore, in addition to the kind of climate change or ecological conditions that make the Philippines vulnerable, it has its own process of urbanization, which creates precarities and vulnerabilities. So really, it's the kind of conflation of being in a precarious ecological part of the world, but also having a certain set of urbanization process related to industrialization, economic growth, economic development, bringing people from less urban areas to more urban areas that are part and parcel of the whole focus on building and strengthening buildings, meaning there are different types of buildings that are required in different parts of the Philippines. Next slide. So what we tried to do is do a little background, and after this slide, I'm going to turn it over to Begonia. We did some case study research, but the one of the important first steps for us was to think carefully about both the possibilities and the limits of one-size-fits-all policies. The IFC, with its Building Resilience Index, which can be used in a lot of different places, and that is the intent, that it should be a valuable tool for many precarious contexts. Every urban area or every nation has a different spatial ecological specificity. So, and also political specificities. The relationships between the national government, municipal governments may be different in different contexts. And even in the Philippines, different municipalities have different programs that are established to address risk resilience in the face of climate change and crisis. They may not all be directed towards buildings, but some places have institutions in place and some places don't. So one of the things we wanted to do in the first stage of the research was do kind of a deep dive into the varieties of different types of social, urban, economic, and spatial contexts in the Philippines, and find out if we could select a couple case studies that could represent different conditions in the Philippines, because we are interested in being able to strengthen the Building Resilience Index for all of the Philippines, but how that might work could be different depending on which municipality and which place. So we did case study research, and with this point, I'm going to turn it over to Begonia, who really led our research team. One more thing before I turn that over to Begonia. We worked with a group of students. Begonia is a doctoral student, as was mentioned, who has extensive experience working for the UN Habitat in precarious environments having to do with urbanization, informality, also climate change. We had an urban design student working with us, and we had an urban planning student. So our team was purposefully transdisciplinary within the design professions to try to think about the variety of ways that we could land some recommendations for the building that might make sense given the community context and the urban spatial context in which disaster will hit. So Begonia, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll take my camera off.
Thank you, Diane. So as Diane was mentioning, we did a deep dive on case studies to really understand the vulnerabilities and the issues being faced in 4 different municipalities. We selected these cities based on their demonstrated interest in climate change and disaster risks management projects, also to ensure that there was diversity in terms of population size and city classifications, and to make sure that we were looking at Metro Manila, but also beyond. So we looked at different key issues across these 4 different areas, including Quezon City, Legazpi City, Ormoc City, and Naga. And we reviewed the priorities that are included in their local plans and the relevance to the building sectors. What are the major challenges being faced? How are they minimizing risks? But also the types of incentives that are available in some of the cities to reduce risks in the built environment, or there's synergies being seeked with, for example, climate change mitigation. like just to give an example, the Green Building Code from Quezon City. Also, we looked at types of incentives, the impacts and types of failures that were experienced in these settings in the past, and so on. And based on this study, we made 3 key recommendations, which we will be going a little bit more in detail now. The first one being how to include or some suggestions on potential modifications to the index that could include a few new metrics, the recalibration of fiscal and policy incentives to generate greater construction sector participation, and the last one, institutionalization of the implementation process so that we could allow more engagement with municipalities who are considered frontline agents in reducing risk in the Philippines, and also to bring more stakeholders on board for the purpose of fostering more robust building resilience index programming. And so we want to highlight, first of all, that we envision resilience as a multiscalar and as an interconnected endeavor where the building is not taken in isolation, but rather connected to the site, to the barangay, and to the city. And Diane mentioned this at the beginning. So we included a set of potential principles that, as mentioned, could recalibrate the index, which include materials and construction, which is very largely covered in the index, also location, typology, and infrastructure. And so this diagrams shows the potential interconnections across these different scales, as well as the opportunities to increase resilience in multiple domains. So let me go to the next slide. In terms of the suggestions that we made, we looked at the logics that underline the Building Resilience Index, and while we know that maybe not all issues could be included and addressed at once, we do believe that a higher index should strive to incorporate as many as these metrics as possible. So, for example, under materials and construction, we acknowledge the importance of considering these beyond the purpose of maintaining the physical integrity of the building, but also, for example, integrating environmental considerations related to the use of materials that can avoid entering conflict with, for example, sustainable issues. We also suggested looking at the typology, and we will go in further detail now, but acknowledging that different buildings deliver different critical functions to the neighborhood, but also to the city. In terms of infrastructure, we're looking at material and energy flows in buildings like water, energy, and waste. And the considerations could include promoting, for example, responsible water use according to the location's climate, prioritizing water-sensitive approaches for management, and closed loop water systems, etc. And lastly, in terms of the location, we want to emphasize the importance of the building's location within the urban fabric. So not only in terms of the exposure that the building faces, but also in terms of the services that it delivers to its surroundings, which could be, for example, that they are used as a safe haven during a disaster event. And so we looked at the different typologies that and how these are functioning differently. So for example, if you have a critical facility, it is really important that these are not disrupted during a serious disaster event. But if you're looking at a hazardous facility, you want to ensure that they're protected because they could unleash secondary hazards and lead to cascading failures. So these are things that we think are important to consider in the strategy for the implementation of the index. Then we had some recommendations in terms of avoiding that it becomes a one-size-fits-all. And first one being the scale, by acknowledging that maybe the ideal scale to intervene is not only always within the project's boundary. So depending on the problem being addressed, it could be beneficial to allow multiple buildings, for example, to operate together to be more cost-effective, etc. We also think it's important to consider flexibility and also the adoption of or the suggesting multiple options to increase resilience, and allow, for example, for incremental approaches that could allow building owners to, with limited resources, to be gradually incrementing the resilience of the property. Secondly, we were looking at recalibration of fiscal and policy incentives, and here we were providing, we looked at different cases both in the Philippines and beyond of, for example, tax credits being used in Quezon, or zoning and counter incentives, grants, etc. And the last recommendation has to do with the institutionalization of the implementation process. So we looked, we think it's very important, as we already mentioned, to really understand what the nuances and what the specificities of each location are. And so here we were trying to understand what's the regulatory and the legislative context, what are the scales of authority involved in the process of building resilience, what are the planning instruments that are being used, who are the key stakeholders that are really advancing resilience in the building sector, what are the key risks being faced. And then in terms of laying out the strategy, as we already mentioned, we really think we should pay attention to three things. Firstly, the spatial aspect, second, the building typology, and third, also the temporal dimension, which has to do with the horizon of the response. And so just to finalize with a few conclusions, we would like to highlight how a modified index would have the following principles. Firstly, that the prioritization of resilience interventions is not only the result of market forces, but is also established based on the essential functions that are being delivered. Secondly, that we are directing efforts to create synergistic relations between buildings, the neighborhoods where they are located, and the communities that they serve. Third, that adaptation and mitigation should be considered in an integrated response, and this was already highlighted by Omid by mentioning that the EDGE program and the Building Resilience Index are being implemented by creating synergies. And lastly, that the high score is not only the result of the physical qualities of a building, but that it also considers the benefits that buildings deliver to society. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Diane and Begonia, for sharing your insights. Now, let me introduce our panelists who will be reacting to the role of Building Resilience Index and these recommendations that were presented. Vice Admiral Alexander Patino Pama is a retired Vice Admiral of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and he is the co-chair of Arise in the Philippines and serves as consultant to the National Resilience Council and SM Prime Holdings Incorporated, among his many other involvements. Dr. Marquesa Catalina L. Reyes is an associate professor at the Asian Institute of Management. She is also the technical advisor for climate and disaster resilience in the Climate Change Commission of the Office of the President. Vincenzo Bolletino is the director of Resilient Communities Program at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And Aris Papadopoulos is the founding chair and CEO of the Resilience Action Fund and one of our senior experts who've helped us develop Building Resilience Index. So if I could ask our discussants please to turn on their videos and microphones so we can start the panel discussion. So the first question we'd like to throw to the panel is, what are your key takeaways from the Harvard study, and what areas or topics can we explore further in our research? So maybe let's start with Aris for this question. Oh, we can't hear you, Aris. Maybe if you can switch your mic, but in the meantime, maybe let's go to Enzo. Enzo, go ahead, please.
So thank you so much. I'm Enzo Bolletino. I work with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and we've been doing research on resilience in the Philippines since about 2016. So one thing I would add, first of all, excellent. I think the building index is excellent, and clearly there's no substitute for strengthening infrastructure when it comes to hazards like earthquakes, and we're seeing that in horrible results in Turkey and Syria with the current earthquake. And we know that the Metro Manila area also has fault lines that run under areas of the city. And so they face similar challenges. So there's absolutely no substitute for really paying attention to infrastructure and doing everything humanly possible to make sure that the buildings themselves can withstand the earthquakes that are expected. But having said that, I would say that the social dimension of resilience is really important as well. And so thinking about people's behavior, how they actually view disasters and experience disasters, where they get their information from, what information they trust, what their expectations are in terms of who's going to deliver services and who's responsible for making people safe, whether it's themselves, whether it's non-governmental organizations, or whether it's the national government or the local government unit. So understanding what people's actual expectations are is really important. And we did a study where we found that the vast majority of Filipinos believe it's that their local government unit is responsible for preparing for and responding to disasters. But I would just look at the social dimensions and think about which social characteristics or factors could be included in the index as well in terms of people's behavior. Over.
Thank you, Enzo. Yeah, I agree. The social dimension and the human factor will play a very important role. And we hope to take this collaboration forward with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. So I think we can go back to Aris.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Thank
I
you.
had switched on the mic on my computer. Thank you, and I really appreciate everything IFC is doing to bring this and, of course, EDGE indices to the world of buildings. I like to say that similar to families being the block for creating strong societies, buildings are the block for creating strong communities. And I think what IFC has done is very unique with the Building Resilience Index. I've been in the building field for many decades, have been involved in disaster risk reduction, and nothing like this has ever existed before. The question I think that raises in my mind from Harvard's kind of analysis is, how do we use the Building Resilience Index? I'm less kind of focusing on changing the index, but asking how could it be used to evaluate then communities and bigger entities, because the index itself has been quite challenging to create in the first place, and as the staff at IFC know, we're still refining and adapting it, and it's a pretty challenging metric, but using it for either evaluating or measuring the resilience of communities, I think is really should be the focus of this topic. I'd be really hesitant to go back and try to make BRI into everything, to change the index itself. I think it'd be very difficult for people to use after that. You'd have to be a consultant to use it. And part of the purpose of the index has been to make it first robust, and second, to make it usable by every possible building, even at the home level, which is a challenge on both sides. So I challenge our thinking in terms of how do we appropriately use it. Some of the topics that were brought up by Begonia, when it comes to materials and energy use and so forth, as Omid has said, we have the parallel edge index, and those really should be focused there. The BRI is really meant to say, will the building survive the hazard? How much damage will the hazard cause to the building? So the two look together, kind of provide that holistic view. In terms of typology, hazards are pretty, non-discriminating when it comes to what type of, what the use of the building is. Obviously, the typology question, in my view, should be answered if you have a critical building. That should be at a very high rating. That should be an A building, or at worst a B building. If a building obviously is less critical, it can afford to be a B or a C. So I would not change the index itself, but how you use the index in terms of evaluating the buildings in the context of the typology and the critical uses, I think then comes into play. So those are a couple of my thoughts, and I appreciate everything everyone has been doing in this regard. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Aris. Obviously, a lot to unpack, but I think what I got there also is looking at not what building resilience index is, but how we are using it. So I think that's a very deep message, and we'll take note of that. At this point, I'd like to ask Yusek Alex to turn on his camera, but as he is doing that, maybe if I can ask Professor Marqueza to share her insights as well.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
All right. Yeah, so thank you so much to the GSD colleagues and of course IFC for giving me this opportunity to share my views on the Building Resilience Index, which I think is a fantastic initiative. well, primarily because I believe in, disaster risk management and risk reduction, prevention, and mitigation. And the idea of using or having a BRI, an index that, provides a house owner or a building owner the, the sense of how much damage and loss will be incurred by the building is actually a very good tool for decision making, especially on resilience financing, which brings me to the point about one key takeaway that I get from the GSD studies that, is the idea of resilience financing that is strategically located, because I think that what they're looking at the bigger picture of this kind of resilience investment. So it's not just looking at how this investments in making these buildings more resilient, not just at the building level, but also how the building actually is synergistically related to the community or their neighborhood where it's located, and how it's actually supporting the resilience of the community, and then at the broader scale, further at the city level as a whole. So I think that that kind of framing, the index would give it a more value add, the way I see it. Okay, so that's my first key takeaway. I just want to mention at this point, because I'm conducting a research on preventive retrofitting. And I think, the BRI is a tool for such, definitely a tool for such um, methodology for preventive retrofitting, particularly for the housing sector. So existing housing stock, right? So the BRI the BRI is actually, something that we can use for the housing sector, both for the private housing sector and the public socialized housing sector, to ensure that this kinds of housing can help protect lives and livelihoods from disasters, and therefore build sustainable communities. So with based on our research, there's 15.6 million units of vulnerable housing in the country, where about 70 million people live in those houses, in those substandard and poorly constructed houses. And it would be good to use this tool to assess the risk and also to manage the risk. And by managing the risk, I mean, um, perhaps there could be something like, I know this is not part of the index, but for example, the financing part, because that's where the rub is. So after assessing the risk, what next? So they know that they need to retrofit and strengthen their houses before any event happens, right? Ahead of time. So, but the question is that in the Philippines, most of the financing programs for housing are post-disaster in nature. Government only pays for post-disaster housing reconstruction and rehabilitation. But before a disaster happens, they don't have financing for that. So perhaps it's something that, focusing on managing the risk, especially on the financing part, is I would like to see more of that in the tool. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Marqueza. We hope to collaborate on your research. And the point about resilience financing, we'll get back to that later. I think there's a question related to that. And I think that's really a space where IFC can fill a gap. And also, I think your point about expanding to the community and to the city level, I think that thread goes back to Ari's point earlier as well, and on how we can expand how we use Building Resilience Index. So at this point, I'd like to turn over the spotlight to USEC Alex Pama. So Arise and USEC Alex has been one of the earliest supporters of this program, and we're looking forward to hearing about your key takeaways. USEC.
Very much, Angelo. First and foremost, I'd like to thank IFC for this opportunity for us to join you in this activity tonight. Well, as a major takeaway, we basically agree with most of the findings that have been conducted by the Hazard Graduate School of Design. And I think it would be superfluous for me to be talking about takeaways, as I think most of us basically are in agreement with that. And I'd like to focus on the topics, maybe in the context of moving forward and in the future of exploring further in future research. Now, while we are in agreement and concur with the study and its findings and recommendations, we have likewise observed that some of the factors affecting the desired outcome of the study may have been overlooked or underemphasized. While the government's role in the implementation of the BRI had been significantly factored in the study, more focus and or detailed treatment and analysis could have been done in certain aspects of resilience that we believe are significant in the holistic and systemic review of the relevance and utility of the risk governance in general and the building resilience using the BRI app in particular. These are in the areas of the needs and the requirements of other significant stakeholders, such as building developers, the financial institutions, and the market or the business side of the buildings, and other structures, especially as it directly affects the acceptability of the adoption of the BRI. We're quite particular in this aspect because we have been partnering with IFC insofar as pushing the envelope for the acceptance of the BRI here in the Philippines. And moving forward, we would venture to put some observations and points that may be considered to improve, not change, Aris, the BRI as a tool and as a program. First, we agree with the results of the recent review done by IFC on the rating system used in the current BIR app, particularly in the aspect of observed hesitation and acceptance and use of the app by certain stakeholders. Developers in particular are worried, at the very least, of the possible effects on the saleability of their buildings due to possible negative implications and or misinterpretations of results of the rating system currently being used. In this regard, we support any move to rectify the rating system that will take into consideration and adopt a revised BIR app. Secondly, in pushing for the implementation of BRI, one other issue that is causing challenges in this adoption and use is the difficulty in finding qualified professionals or even associations or organizations whose members or personnel have the qualification and the competence willing to undertake the role of verifiers. The hesitation on their part comes from the perceived loopholes in the technical and practical aspects of the parameters used in the app. There is also the issue of the absence of accepted conventions, protocols to be followed or adhered to by these professional and technical organizations. Thus, the process flow becomes a challenge in the implementation of the BRI and consequently in the validity and acceptability of the rating system. It is therefore an imperative that this particular aspect of the BRI, which is the verification step, be legitimized either by formal arrangements or understandings with the relevant professional or technical organizations or societies. Lastly, in regard to the issue of incentives regulation, our partner developers also stated that this issue remained to be a key driver for adoption at scale. Relying purely on private sector initiative will only get us so far. We really need a robust combination of the so-called carrot and sticks to truly scale. Otherwise, BRI adoption will plateau and remain limited to a small percentage of buildings. This is a direct quote from one of our active developers pushing the envelopes as well. It is therefore imperative to granularize this issue and identify and characterize the so-called critical points or players, if only to harmonize and institutionalize and make the implementation of the BRI as a program beyond its nature as a tool for building resilience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yusek, for your substantive inputs. On the first point, we are looking at the rating system itself. So we will be making an announcement regarding that in the next few days. I think on the second and third points, they touch on verification with professionals and then also working with the public sector on incentives. I think that's really where we can leverage a RISE network in the Philippines, who has connected with these professional associations and the public sector. And I think those inputs dovetail nicely with our next question. And Recognizing that we only have a few minutes in this webinar, I'd like to ask our discussants to please keep their responses short. So based on the findings, do you have suggestions on how Building Resilience Index as a tool and as a program can be improved in the future? So maybe we can go to Aris first. Aris, go ahead.
I think excellent points brought up by the Admiral. Pama, thank you. The rating, as you mentioned, Angelo, needs to become more marketable. Obviously, people getting a C rating, feel that they failed, so, but on the other hand, we've, have comments that a lot of the buildings that collapsed in Turkey probably would be C's. So, it's a dilemma to put something that, may cause fatalities and deaths in the future. So we need to be careful there. The other thing is training. I think training, verifiers, and training is a two-way street in the sense that we can provide training to engineers, registered engineers who will probably function as verifiers, and also get their feedback at the same time. So I'm looking for those opportunities that we can have more training sessions, which can act as two-way communication. Back to you, Angelo.
Thank you, Aris. Now let's go to Enzo.
Sure. So one of the things that I would mention is, in addition to what Yusek Pama said about the verifiability, is building in some kind of robust monitoring mechanism that really allows for verification that the implementation side of things is going forward in line with the recommendations that come out of the index. I think another important aspect, and it's really a question that I have about some of the variables in the index. Does it account for changes that are part of climate change? So, for example, sea level rise, increased soil salinization. Suddenly you're in a position where you may be retrofitting a building, but other factors may undermine the integrity of the building depending on where it is. And then finally, I would say that I think a really important aspect of this is the actual sequencing and prioritization of where you begin, because clearly you want to begin, I think, where there's the greatest confluence of vulnerability and the highest likelihood of there being a catastrophic event. And as we know, programs are not always implemented based on those factors. So I think it's important that the sequencing and the prioritization is based on some really meaningful evidence and data.
Thank you so much, Enzo. At this point, I'd like to call on Professor Marqueza for her suggestions on the improvement of BRI.
Thanks, Angelo. I'd like to follow up what I said earlier about resilience financing, because as I said, the current policy regime in the Philippines is more on financing post-disaster recovery and post-disaster house recovery and reconstruction. But I'm looking more into how the program can be more have more value add in the sense that in managing the risk, that part of the program. Perhaps IFC can provide evidence to support the advocacy of building resilient buildings or housing from design to construction, and from throughout the whole value chain process, and show that because in your managing the risk module in the tool, you provide mitigation measures in order to lessen the damage and loss, right? Perhaps you can also provide the affordability aspect of it, because the affordability and financing constraint will actually spell whether actions and investment will be given or will be provided by the house owner or the building owner into making their building or housing more resilient. So I think that's very important. And then the second part is that, again, for the BRI program, I think it would add value again if you embed or institutionalize resilience in the regulations and incentives as well. Considering that consider resilience objectives in the master plans already, standards and regulations, and to make sure that these are consistent with risk-informed land use plan, for example, and building codes. So, and finally, I would like to mention, you know, the country, the current government is undertaking a massive 4PH program, meaning this is a shelter program that's undertaken by the government that's aiming to construct 6 million new, decent, and affordable housing units for low-income families. And perhaps I know that this will be the BRI tool is for existing buildings, but the BRI program perhaps can do advocacy on the, using the BRI index and the tool in terms of, in terms of those master plans and standards that this, this housing program, massive housing program is actually going to do. So because if we're continually constructing affordable houses, yes, but they're unsustainable and they're not resilient, then we are actually just creating more headaches for ourselves for the future. So I think it's better to provide that investment now during the master planning stage. That's it. Thank you, Angelo.
Thank you, Prof. Marqueza. So more prevention before repair, right? And recognizing that the AIM has a lot of institutional partnerships with the public sector, I hope that as you engage with them, you bring us into these conversations as well so that we can
Sure.
explore the
Sure.
incentives. So, Yusek Alex, I know that you've given suggestions on BRI already. If you have other suggestions, otherwise, if I can also ask you to close the panel discussion on behalf of the panelists, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think much has been said and done relative to the BRI. And I think the study that has been made by Harvard Graduate School of Design is basically something that all of us can make use of. In our opinion, this is something that we can use as some sort of a roadmap or even a sale plan, if you may, in the Navy, in moving forward relative to the implementation of the BRI. And in line with this, we believe that the study has breached the apparent limited scope of metrics and criteria in the current BRI Act and has been open to certain realities on the ground, needing rectification of the process in consideration of the larger context and paradigm for the implementation of the BRI as a tool in the program. There should be an effort to find ways to identify and utilize further new and added metrics appropriate to the geographic and socioeconomic risk factors relevant to the resilience of buildings and the community where it is located. It is therefore imperative that this BRI should be a dynamic tool and program in pushing forward the envelope for a more resilient buildings and communities where they are located. Thank you very much.
Such an empowering message and call to action. Thank you, Sec Alex. So at this point, I would like to ask the audience to maybe stay for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. We'd like to accommodate a couple of questions. We do apologize in advance that we will not be able to address all of the questions, but do continue sending them so we can address them through email after the webinar. There's this recurring theme in all of the feedback that we received, which is on resilience financing. Now, there was a question in chat that said, is there funding that's going to be provided for the Building Resilience Index in the Philippines? And also, what is the government of the Philippines doing about it? So this relates to resilience finance. Maybe if I can invite Omid to answer this question based from his experience, maybe even in other countries or even with EDGE, how do we channel financing towards resilience?
Thank you, Angelo. And this is a very important question. The way that we see the financing, when I try to imagine the shape of this in a city, for example, if you imagine there's a big tank of water somewhere, and then you have houses that they need water, right? To get the water from the tank to the houses, you need to have pipes, and these pipes need to be aligned, and everything needs to be set so that the water can flow to those houses. And the financing is very similar in that nature, because there is international donors that they really want to support resilience across the world, mainly in Philippines and also now in Turkey and other countries. So they have the resources to support. And then we have the needs on the ground level, right? When we look at the new housing projects that you mentioned, new Philippines, 6 million houses in Philippines, they require funding to improve their resilience. However, what's happening is that these two are not connected. There's no pipe between these two to flow the money to the assets. So what we have done on Edge, we have enabled the financing through the local banks in other countries. So what happens is that we bring the donor money to the banks, and the banks then channel the money to the end builders or end mortgage borrowers. So what happens is that as a mortgage borrower or as a builder, let's say if you're building a house and the cost of building the house is $40,000 and there's $10,000 extra for making it resilient or green, that delta will be covered by donor money, so that the cost does not go to the builder, so that they can easily cover that. So that this can encourage them that they will see this is not a burden on the builders. But also we enable better mortgages. What it means is that if you buy a house in these homes, you will get a lower mortgage rate, and that's a benefit for the person that is going to purchase these homes. So that's how we try to channel the funds to the projects. We also try to bring tax incentives or other incentives that government can provide, like better permitting or faster permits, or providing even extra floor to the homes or projects that they are resilient or green. So these are together then starts to move the market. As I said, again, this is not an easy task. Angelo and the team on the ground in the Philippines are speaking with multiple financial institutions right now to see how we can enable such connection. Resilience is a young concept in the building sector and the financial sector, so we have to work together to enable these flows of funds.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And thank you for emphasizing the strength of IFC as a development finance institution, right? So we bring in investment through resilience loans or maybe resilience mortgage facilities. And in that process, also bring in blended finance and the strength of our advisory offer towards helping various stakeholders do more resilient building. So thank you for that. I think we have room for one more question. And maybe for this question, I'd like to invite Begonia or Diane to talk about. So there's this perceived conflict between building regulators or enforcers and building developers who often see themselves on opposite sides of the spectrum, and there's no virtuous feedback loop between the two. So maybe if Begonia or Diane can share with us if this surfaced in their findings, and also maybe if they have some examples they can share that could potentially close this gap.
Maybe I'll jump in there. I'm sure Begonia has some comments too. I was looking at that excellent question in the chat. Of course, that's a quintessential question that plagues all of us who are interested in urban development, right? It's not only about the Building Resilience Index. I guess one thing I would just I'm going to try to avoid the answer, but I want to come back to what the Admiral said, because I do think that ultimately what I felt like your reading of our project really and your comments really summarize what we are trying to kind of highlight in the report, which was how do we take the how question, that I guess is this question, how do you use this Building Resilience Index? The Admiral suggested that we think about the ways in which the index and the way we finance incentives to use it are connected to the political and governance context in which cities live, right? You didn't answer the question of whether it's the national government or the barangay, the municipality, I think one has to have all three of those involved, but it's a matter of strategically connecting incentives at the scale of building through priorities in the neighborhood up to the government level where money will also be flowing. And I think that gets a little bit to the Christoph Chung's question in the chat about how you connect the builders to the developers. Communities are very important mediators in those processes. So it's not just the kind of the government regulators and the builders, but how all those stakeholders are brought together to discuss and leverage priorities for money, I think is very important. And that, although we haven't gone far enough on that in the research, because in the report we focus on implementation, that was the point. How do we make sure that everybody's interests can be best aligned? They all won't be totally fully in sync, but enough overlap that what is needed at the community level, whether a homeowner or a builder, is in alignment with the community disaster resilience plans as well as the government's priorities. So it's just a kind of a reframing of all the important points, because somebody talked about, Enzo talked about the social, Marqueza talked about the financing, we talked about the builders and the in-laws, and we've talked about the government. So I want to just thank Omid and Naz for bringing this really good group of people together to help us think about what the next steps are. But Begonia, I don't know if you have more examples because you work for the UN.
I mean, I think you covered, and Marquez also mentioned, for example, how local governments are working on their development plans, on their land use plans, on the zoning regulations. It's a matter of getting everyone on the table to really, as you say, align on these things and have everyone work together towards resilience. So that's, I think we covered that.
Thank you so much, Begonia. Now, there was a question about opportunities for the private sector to get involved in testing the BRI application. So the good news is that BRI, the tool, is free. So please engage with us so that we can guide you through the inputting process. At this point, we've come at the end of the webinar, and we'd like to thank the Harvard University Graduate School of Design for collaborating with us in our efforts to enhance resilience of buildings and cities, and all of you for participating in this webinar. The recording of this event will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. Please fill in our survey, which we shared in the chat, to help us improve our future events. Should you wish to know more about Building Resilience Index, please visit our website, resilienceindex.org. Have a great day and happy weekend. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.